This is a Fox News alert. I'm Bret Baier in Washington. The U.S. military makes history as North Korea attempts to join the historically small group of nations with the ability to send a nuclear weapon across thousands of miles. An American interceptor missile successfully destroyed an intercontinental ballistic missile today in what could be a dress rehearsal for a North Korean attack on the U.S. West Coast or other U.S. territory. Senior U.S. commanders say this test was long planned, but it clearly sends a message that the U.S. is stepping up efforts to defend the U.S. homeland from threats like North Korea. Chief Correspondent Jonathan Hunt is live at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. Good evening, Jonathan.
Good evening, Bret. This was, without doubt, the most critical test yet of the U.S. missile defense system, with the Pentagon under huge pressure to deliver a successful strike and thus send a powerful message to North Korea or any other nation that might target the United States. The launch of the ground-based interceptor missile was spectacular and deadly serious, testing the first line of U.S. defense should North Korea fire a nuclear weapon at an American city, a capability the Pentagon believes Pyongyang will soon have.
In my view, it's a matter of time.
Vice Admiral James Searing is the director of the Missile Defense Agency and sat for a rare and exclusive interview with Fox News ahead of the test, in which the U.S. is simulating a North Korean attack by launching an unarmed intercontinental ballistic missile from the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean and aiming to take it down with the interceptor launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California.
It's very difficult. We're talking about intercepting in space at hundreds of miles of altitude with closing velocities of thousands of miles per hour. It's hitting a bullet with a bullet.
And the difficulties have been evident in past tests, with the interceptor only hitting its target about half the time. But Admiral Searing insists that technology has improved markedly since the last test in 2014.
I'm very confident through tactics and procedures that this system can and will defend the homeland if attacked.
Fox News was also given exclusive access to the 49th Missile Defense Battalion at Fort Greely, Alaska, where 32 of the U.S. total of 36 interceptors are based in these silos. Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Brower is the commanding officer.
You've got a nuclear weapon fired heading for L.A. How many of these do you fire to take it down?
So the tactics, techniques, and procedures, those are classified, but I'll say we fire more than one. If we're talking about a nuclear warhead headed to L.A., we want to make sure that we get it.
Weapons. Engage the threat to Los Angeles.
And that's why the soldiers here work simulated attacks every day of every week.
Target to Los Angeles has been successfully intercepted and destroyed.
When we're all watching the news and seeing North Korea preparing for a test, you guys are at a very different level here.
Absolutely. We are ready to fight tonight.
And tonight, as Pentagon officials breathe a huge sigh of relief at this successful intercept test, those missile defense crews are indeed at their stations, ready to do their part and aware that when it comes to a real nuclear attack, they cannot afford to fail even once. Bret?
Jonathan Hunt, live in California. Jonathan, thank you. More on this with the panel. President Trump's communications director is out tonight. Michael Dubke's resignation comes amid turbulent times for the administration, particularly when it comes to communication. This as White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer was back in the briefing room today, pushing back hard on some pointed storylines facing the president and his team. Correspondent Kevin Cork live on the North Lawn tonight. Good evening, Kevin.
Hey, good evening, Bret. You're right. For the first time in over 2 weeks, Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary, briefed reporters on camera here in the briefing room, but he left the podium somewhat abruptly after sparring with reporters over so-called fake news.
It was as sudden as it was heated. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer's first on-camera briefing in over 2 weeks quickly unraveled today after he was asked about the president's tweet on fake news. Mr. Trump writing, Russian officials must be laughing at the U.S. and how a lame excuse for why the Democrats lost the election has taken over the fake news. Asked today to give an example of that, Mr. Spicer said this.
On Friday, the president was having a great discussion at the G7. and someone from the BBC and ultimately an incoming reporter from the New York Times retweeted that the president was being rude by disrespecting the Italian prime minister.
But after some reporters said that wasn't so much of a big deal, the press secretary shot back.
The reason that the president is frustrated is because there's a perpetuation of false narratives, a use of unnamed sources over and over again about things that are happening that don't ultimately happen, and I think that is troubling.
The contentious briefing coming on a day when the White House's communications director, Mike Dubke, confirmed he's resigned after just 3 months on the job. Dubke writing, "The reasons for my departure are personal, but it has been my great honor to serve President Trump and this administration." Dubke's decision to leave is not unprecedented. In fact, President Obama's first communication director, Ellen Moran, also left the post after 3 months on the job for landing over at Commerce. His departure seemed to confirm the president's frustration that his shop's been unable to slow stories suggesting ties between the Trump campaign and Russia, none of which have been proven true.
They've really been kind of a Spartan crowd at the White House. They need to beef it up, and they need to bring in some talent who are dedicated to the president's agenda.
Talent like that of Mr. Trump's former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, who's rumored to be under consideration to join a retooled White House war room.
The president has always surrounded himself with people who are able to work together and in a collaborative fashion are able to deal with the news of the day, but also think more long-term and strategically.
All this comes as the president's America First agenda is now challenging the status quo abroad. His tweet that we have a massive trade deficit with Germany, plus they pay far less than they should on NATO and military, very bad for U.S., this will change, followed German Chancellor Angela Merkel's suggestion that Europe now needs to put its destiny into its own hands.
And of course, those comments coming on the heels of the president's refusal to back the Paris Climate Accord during that trip to the G7, choosing instead, Bret, to study it further. We also learned today the president interviewed a couple of more candidates for the vacant FBI director position, Christopher Wren, Assistant Attorney General, and a name you may remember, former number 2, James Pistol, number 2 at the FBI. He also once headed the TSA. Bret?
Kevin Cork, live on the North Lawn. Kevin, thank you. Let's get the latest tonight on the Russia investigations and the connection to presidential advisor and presidential son-in-law, Jared Kushner, what we know and what we don't know. Here's Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge.
A source who has spoken to presidential advisor Jared Kushner tells Fox News that the December meeting at Trump Tower with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak and former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn focused on Syria and Russia's contention that the Obama administration policy was deeply flawed. As part of his transition role engaging with foreign delegations, the source said Kushner wanted to do a call between Russian generals on the ground in Syria and Flynn to further understand their complaints. According to the source, Kushner said it was the Russians who raised the issue of using a secure line for the call, emphasizing it was a one-off for a conversation about Syria and not a permanent back channel as alleged in media reports. The White House spokesman was pressed on the issue.
How is it that it's appropriate for someone who is a private citizen, not sworn in as an official of the U.S. government, to conduct any kind of negotiation or diplomacy with a foreign official?
Again, I would just refer you to both the comments that Secretary Kelly, General McMaster have said about how they can be an important tool in diplomacy.
Based on intercepted Russian communications, anonymous sources told the Washington Post, which broke the story, that Kushner wanted to set up a back channel using Russian diplomatic facilities to apparently make them more difficult to track. Kushner's lawyer said he is willing to share what he knows with Congress. The Post also reported the Russians have embellished stories in the past to sow confusion because they know their communications are monitored. But unnamed officials told the paper it was unclear how the Russian ambassador would have benefited. The testimony of Carter Page, an informal foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign, has been postponed indefinitely from its scheduled date of June 7th. Page, who is at the center of the anti-Trump dossier, continues to deny he was Moscow's point of contact.
There is no basis. I'm a loyal American, and I served my country in the military.
In a letter to the House Intelligence Committee, Page wrote, "The urgency of delivering truthful facts really does matter, and this exigent necessity has only seemed to grow in recent days."
A source familiar with the congressional matter said Page's testimony was put off at the request of committee Democrats. A spokesman for the ranking member, Adam Schiff, had no comment for our reporting. And since we've been on the air, the Associated Press is now reporting that the former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn will provide records under subpoena to the Senate Intelligence Committee. As you recall, his lawyer had said previously that he would not cooperate, citing his Fifth Amendment protections. Brett.
The timing of all of this with now Michael Flynn, we'll see if he's going to provide these documents. And then when Jim Comey testifies, there's a lot that still we don't know on the timing up on Capitol Hill.
Well, the critical testimony will be the former FBI director, and it could happen within a matter of weeks, but it's really anyone's guess at this point.
Yeah, Catherine, thank you.
You're welcome.
President Trump has a suggestion for the U.S. Senate. Get rid of the filibuster altogether. The president is trying to push his agenda forward, but Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel reports tonight it might not make much difference.
With Congress on recess, there are signs President Trump is losing patience waiting for major legislative accomplishments. The president tweeted this morning about changing the Senate rules to 51 votes to get health care and tax cuts approved fast and easy.
The frustration that he's had with the pace of some of the legislation and some of the obstructionist tactics that Democrats have employed, whether it's his cabinet nominees or other pieces of legislation, has been well documented.
The problem is the Senate has been looking to repeal and replace Obamacare and do major tax reform through budget reconciliation, which would allow them to be passed with 51 votes. So far, there isn't consensus among Republicans on those major issues, and Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has ruled out changing Senate rules for legislation.
There's not a single senator in the majority who thinks we ought to change the legislative filibuster, not one.
Today, a key House Republican insisted the agenda is not stalled.
Senates have to get off their hind ends and start finding a compromise on health care so they can match us in the House. If that happens, then we're able to use the revenue from Obamacare to move our tax dials down and get actually tax reform. So it's happening, but it's happening relatively slowly.
And Democrats are not inclined to help unless it's on their terms on issues like health care.
I don't think that the Republicans can do this themselves. I don't think they should be doing it by themselves. I think we can work I think we should be working in a bipartisan way on this very obviously very, very, very important issue to everybody.
With Congress slow to put points on the board on major overhauls, there is concern about the impact on Republicans seeking re-election in 2018. Vice President Mike Pence is expected to crisscross the Midwest and South this summer. Sources close to Pence say the idea is supporting Republicans who are helping the president's agenda.
As for the agenda, there are limitations to what can be done under reconciliation, which is a frustration for many Republicans right now. If Congress were seeking to do all of health care reform, a complete repeal and replace plan, it would right now require 60 votes in the Senate. And if they tried to pass permanent major tax cuts, that would also require 60 votes. So to do the entire major ticket items, they need to scrap the legislative filibuster, which Senate leaders don't sound prepared to do. Brett?
We'll talk about it with the panel. Mike, thank you. We're awaiting word from the White House about what President Trump may do about Cuba. The administration is doing a review of current policy, and many believe this president will undo much of what the last president did. Correspondent Rich Edson is at the State Department tonight with an update. Good evening, Rich.
Good evening, Brett. And the Trump administration is still reviewing United States policy towards Cuba. That's according to a State Department official. In 2015, the Obama administration restored long-broken diplomatic relations, and while there still are restrictions, the U.S. now allows Americans to more easily travel to Cuba and conduct business there. Obama administration officials said in 2015 they were trying to solidify improved relations, and one analyst says fully reversing them won't be easy.
A number of the changes that have been made over multiple rounds over the course of the last few years of the Obama administration are going to be incredibly difficult to reverse. There are certain aspects of what was changed that can be reversed, but I think it will be very much at the edges rather than changes that would potentially result in job losses.
Cuban-American Senators Marco Rubio and Bob Menendez oppose former President Obama's Cuba policies, arguing better relations financially benefit benefit and enable the Castro dictatorship that represses its people. And while there is bipartisan opposition to improved relations, there is also bipartisan support, especially as American businesses travel with greater frequency to sell Cubans telecom and farming equipment and travel services. They argue Cuba will simply seek partnerships with other countries if the U.S. withdraws. And one congressional aide says there are discussions and talks about potentially using this policy review as a way to push the regime in Cuba to give a little ground on human rights concessions. Bret?
Rich Edson, live at the State Department. Rich, thank you. Venezuelan opposition leader Enrique Capriles was hit with tear gas during a protest yesterday in Caracas. The former presidential candidate was gassed by soldiers trying to control an opposition protest that blocked a highway. Demonstrators trying to march on a government office were stopped by hundreds of soldiers in riot gear and armored cars. It's just the latest violence during near daily anti-government protests in Venezuela. As hunger is now an issue on the streets there, we'll continue to follow that situation in Caracas and throughout that country. Longtime Panamanian leader Manuel Noriega has died. Noriega had a complicated relationship with both his people and the U.S. Correspondent Doug McElway takes a look.
He was the quintessential Central American dictator, rising to power in 1983, 2 years after his predecessor Omar Torrijos was killed in a mysterious plane crash. Manuel Noriega didn't win Panama's leadership as much as he took it, with a ruthless reign of torture and assassination of political rivals.
I met with Noriega many times. I described him as the most despicable human being I'd ever met, and I've met a lot of despicable human beings.
Yet Noriega was a valuable asset to the CIA, offering intelligence about Central American adversaries. But he also played the other side, providing drug cartels safe harbor and selling thousands of Panamanian passports to Cuban dictator Fidel Castro, giving Cuban spies instant cover. His biggest threat was to the Panama Canal. President Reagan and later George H.W. Bush worried about a power-crazed strongman in control of the Western Hemisphere's main shipping route.
Damage to one lock, significant damage to one lock, could shut the canal down for weeks, months, if it was bad enough, maybe for years.
A tipping point came in early December 1989 when a handful of American troops stationed in Panama were ambushed by Noriega's soldiers.
This is a real demonstration of what this man really intends to do. So as you look ahead at the trajectory, it just gets worse. It was time to take this military commander out.
As president, I have no higher obligation than to safeguard the lives of American citizens.
On December 20th, 1989, President Bush sent 27,000 American troops to invade Panama. Noriega's troops were quickly overwhelmed. Noriega sought refuge in the Vatican embassy until he surrendered and was brought to the United States to face trial. He served 8 years, was then sent to France to face another money laundering trial before being extradited back to Panama to serve out another sentence. He died in a hospital yesterday, still a prisoner. 23 U.S. troops lost their lives in the U.S. attack against Noriega. Admiral Stufflebeam says he vividly remembers flying to Camp David with President Bush as the casualty figures came in. The president spent the weekend writing the families of those 23 who gave their lives. Bret?
Doug, thank you. Up next, a deadly day of bombings in Baghdad. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 12 in Portland with the arraignment of the man accused of killing 2 people during a stabbing on one of the city's light rail cars. The victims had come to the aid of 2 women after Jeremy Joseph Christian began yelling at them with what is termed hate speech. A 3rd bystander was injured. The 2 women were unhurt. Fox 5 in Atlanta as early voting begins for the special congressional election that has drawn a lot of national attention. Democrat John Ossoff and Republican Karen Handel are vying for the seat vacated by Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price. Election Day is June 20th there. And this is a live look at Miami from Fox affiliate WSVN. The big story there tonight, a police report says Tiger Woods was asleep at the wheel of his vehicle when officers spotted his car stopped along a Florida road. The report says Woods had no alcohol in his system. The golfer says he had taken several prescription drugs. His arraignment on a DUI charge is scheduled for July 5th. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back.
Needles. Essential.
Dozens are dead tonight after a brutal day of bombings in Baghdad. Correspondent Connor Powell reports from our Middle East newsroom.
On the second night of Ramadan, Islam's holiest month, as families packed Baghdad's streets to break their day-long fast, a closed-circuit camera caught the first blast at a local ice cream parlor. Among the 17 dead, women and children. Hours later, a second explosion outside a government building, killing 14. ISIS claiming responsibility for both attacks, saying its suicide bombers had targeted gatherings of Shia Muslims. Later in the day, bombings in and around the Iraqi capital killed at least 7 more people. The Sunni terror group considers Shiites to be infidels. But this Iraqi woman says ISIS are the real non-believers.
Only infidels like ISIS kill people during Ramadan. We should love each other. We are all Iraqis at the end of the day.
Today's attacks come as the Iraqi military, backed by U.S. air and ground forces, continue the months-long operation to retake Mosul. ISIS seized the northern city nearly 3 years ago, but now control only a few blocks. The final battle against ISIS in Mosul, however, will be no easy task. Insurgents are dug in, and the old city is densely populated, with militants intermixed with some 200,000 civilians, and it's a maze of twisting and turning small streets. Iraqi forces will have to forego their heavy, up-armored vehicles, doing most of the fighting on foot. But ISIS is also pinned in by the Tigris River and surrounded. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis said this weekend in an interview with CBS News that the United States has revised its battle plan.
We have already shifted from attrition tactics where we shove them from one position to another in Iraq and Syria to annihilation tactics where we surround them. Our intention is that the foreign fighters do not survive the fight to return home.
Iraqi commanders have said publicly they want to retake Mosul before the 3rd anniversary of ISIS's capture of the city on June 10th. And while ISIS will likely be defeated in Mosul, it's unlikely to happen in the next 12 days. Bret?
Connor Powell in our Middle East newsroom. Connor, thank you. Back here in the U.S., we are learning new information tonight that would seem to back up those people, including President Trump, who allege there is much more voter fraud in this country than people talk about or officials acknowledge. Here's correspondent Peter Ducey with one example. Good evening, Peter.
Good evening, Brett. Even though the right to vote is reserved for U.S. citizens, just across the river from the nation's capital in Virginia, thousands of non-citizens have apparently been on voter rolls for years. That's according to new research by the Public Interest Legal Foundation that finds 5,556 non-citizens were removed from rolls between 2011 and 2017, and 1,852 of them cast ballots, a total of 7,474 times. The White House has set up a task force to investigate President Trump's concerns about voter fraud, like this one that he tweeted during the transition, quote, "Serious voter fraud in Virginia, New Hampshire, and California. So why isn't the media reporting on this? Serious bias, big problem." And because millions of ballots are cast every Virginia statewide election, these illegal ballots likely haven't impacted a statewide result, but the group who put this report out is worried they could at a local level.
We have a tendency to focus on presidential elections and statewide elections, but our report goes into detail about elections more at the local level, which can affect people's daily lives just as much. And we found numerous elections that were decided by single-digit or just double-digit voting margins. So, it does not take a large number of voters to swing an election either way.
The commissioner of Virginia's Department of Elections emailed me today to say, quote, "As the Public Interest Legal Foundation's report shows, Virginia election officials have been and are continuing to promptly remove individuals who self-identify as non-citizens from the statewide voter registration list in accordance with federal and state law. Still, even though these non-citizens are only outed when they tell officials they aren't citizens, Governor Terry McAuliffe has repeatedly vetoed bills that would increase scrutiny on voters, saying in one March veto, quote, "As Virginia already has one of the strictest voter photo ID laws in the country, the addition of photos from the Department of Motor Vehicles database to the poll book folks will have no effect on election integrity. I reached out to Governor McAuliffe's office for comment about this story, and I'm still waiting to hear back from Richmond. Bret.
Okay, Peter, thank you. Just as boxers must go to their corners at the end of a round, Texas state lawmakers are returning to their districts after a raucous end to a divisive and often confrontational legislative session. Correspondent Casey Stiegel tells us about what the fighting was about.
A scuffle breaks out between Texas lawmakers on what was intended to be an uneventful end to the 2017 legislative session.
Of course, you don't want things like that to happen on the House floor.
Democratic State Congressman Pancho Nevarez says he was upset after hearing one of his Republican colleagues called federal immigration authorities on protesters who had descended on the Capitol in opposition to a new law that bans so-called sanctuary cities. State Representative Matt Rinaldi says he phoned the feds. Then witnesses say the two elected leaders got in each other's faces and even tossed around threats.
You heard him say, I'll put a bullet in your head. Said that to the representative in his direction.
Rinaldi admitted to saying he'd shoot Congressman Nevarez only in self-defense, alleging Nevarez threatened him first, something the Democrat says never happened.
Guys like him think they can say whatever they want with impunity, and at some point there's going to be a repercussion and a reckoning.
Earlier in the day, protesters became disruptive in the gallery, setting off an explosive chain of events.
The chair asks the Sergeant at Arms and the Department of Public Safety to remove all persons from the gallery.
Police were called in to boot those interfering with official business, while Congressman Rinaldi says he called Immigration and Customs Enforcement since some of the demonstrators were holding signs saying they were in the country illegally. Democrats say there were no such signs, and ICE says it was never called. After the dust settled, the Dallas area Republican later conceded his behavior was to get a reaction.
You say things to incite people, okay? And that's exactly what I did.
Despite Monday's debacle in Austin, the governor of this state may have to call a special legislative session to address business items they did not get to this go-around. Bret?
Casey Stiegel, live in Dallas. Casey, thanks. The owner of the infamous 3 Mile Island nuclear plant says the facility will shut down in 2019 without a financial rescue from the state of Pennsylvania. In 1979, you may remember, equipment failure and operator errors led to a partial core meltdown of one of the island's 2 reactors. The other still works, but management says it has sustained more than 5 years of financial losses. A down day on Wall Street today. The Dow lost 51. The S&P 500 dropped 3. The Nasdaq was off 7. Bounty hunters in Florida have been going after some unusual prey this year. They are Burmese pythons, and they have risen to the top of the food chain in the Everglades. Correspondent Phil Keating tells us what's being done about it.
Whoa! Oh my God. Florida's python problem is now so big and so bad, the state's now paying a python posse to hunt the invasive predators and kill them.
The cool thing for us as swamp-based looking for pythons is, first and foremost, pythons are cool, man. They're huge. As a country boy, we get to jump on big snakes. Go to the next one.
Tom Rahill founded Swamp Ace. He's one of 25 snake wranglers getting paid $8 an hour to drive, hike,
send the borescope into this hole
and probe through the hot and humid Everglades looking for the well-camouflaged constrictors and taking war veterans out with him.
It's really soothing, just being out here in nature, searching for the pythons. There's nothing like it.
We can log in many, many hours, sometimes days and days, without finding a python. So.
And then there are those days where we'll find 13 in one day.
The professional python hunters also get $50 for every snake killed, and for each foot longer than 4, that's $25 extra. With 150 pythons removed, the $175,000 pilot program has so far proven to be far more effective than the state's previous python challenges, which relied on thousands of amateurs.
These are people that are passionate about the Everglades. They're passionate about dealing with the problem with the pythons. They're out here on a regular basis. They know where to find the snakes.
and they've had good results.
Get him, Joe. The largest python captured, a 16-footer, and they are ravaging Florida's small mammal population.
There's no place for them. They don't belong here.
About half of the pythons captured so far have been females, and every female can lay on average 40 eggs per clutch. So if you do the math, that's an additional 2,000 pythons that will not hatch in these Everglades. Bret?
Ugh, no thank you. Whew. History in the skies. The U.S. intercepts an ICBM. We'll discuss that breaking news and the rest of the news of the day out of Washington with the panel after a break.
It's very difficult. We're talking about intercepting in space at hundreds of miles of altitude with closing velocities of thousands of miles per hour. It's hitting a bullet with a bullet. The system that has been designed is operational today on watch 24/7 with soldiers, airmen, and sailors operating both the Homeland Defense System and the regional defense systems. The flight test intercept track record on the current fielded missiles is 4 for 7 in terms of successful intercept tests.
Well, now it's 5 for 8. After this test today, an interceptor hitting an ICBM off of California, and the ICBM being launched from the Marshall Islands, and there you see the video put out by the Pentagon. This is a big deal in context as we watch this, because obviously North Korea and all that we've heard about what they're trying to do, this would be the defense for the U.S. homeland. Republican Senator Dan Sullivan from Alaska put out this statement. This test clearly demonstrates to our adversaries that our Homeland Missile Defense System remains on track to defend our country. Today is an important day for our nation's missile defenders, our scientists and engineers, and the American people. The successful intercept test of an ICBM-like target sends a clear message to the unstable dictator in North Korea that the U.S. ballistic missile defense system can and will shoot down any ballistic missile threat that endangers the American people. While I'm thankful this test was a success, and I look forward to the emplacement of the remaining GBIs at Fort Greely, we need to do more to ensure that our missile defense system continues to advance ahead of the rapidly increasing North Korean threat. And as you can imagine, Senator Sullivan has a piece of legislation to do just that. Let's bring in our panel. Start there with the news of the day. Charles Hurt, opinion editor for The Washington Times. A.B. Stoddard, associate editor at Real Clear Politics, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Charles, big deal.
It's a big deal, and it's just in time. I mean, we really are reaching a point in history where we are going to be susceptible to a rogue state, meaning North Korea, could be Iran later, hitting the homeland with a nuclear weapon, and we need a way to shoot it down. As of a few years ago, we had no way to do it. Americans didn't understand that if a missile is launched at us, there's no way to stop it. It's going to hit, it's going to kill. And I must say, there's a partisan note here. This is after 35 years of Democrats doing everything they could to slow down the program and to stop it to where they could. This is originally Reagan's vision, but he had two ideas. One was to be able to shoot down the entire Russian arsenal, which was Star Wars, and it was a fantasy. That's impossible. But it was very important to develop defenses that would shoot down 1 or 2 rockets at a time from small states, unstable states, that would not be susceptible to deterrence. That's what we have here. What we need to do now is to mass produce these, to put them up in Alaska and in California, because the North Koreans have announced they're going to start to mass produce their rockets, and they have shown tremendous advance in their rockets, even in the last couple of months. So this is a race between offense and defense, and thank God our defense appears to be working.
Maybe.
I agree. It's a huge, significant step, and it's a relief, but it's not finished, and we have a long way to go in terms of progress. And obviously, we prefer deterrence. We prefer that the Chinese work with us, and that this is used as a last resort. They will use multiple missiles if they ever are successful. They'll have to be in the right places and have the perfect reaction time, but we really need to get something going in addition to this with our allies to try to make sure that this doesn't happen.
This has been a long time coming, Charlie, but this current threat obviously fits perfectly, and it's kind of a good day to have this test go right.
And why I think it was a highly anticipated test. You know, it was a high-stakes gamble, and by all accounts, it was a total success, which is a good thing. But I you know, going back to what Charles said at the beginning, I think it's so crucial to remember that over the past 30 years, the political opposition to this, whether it was mocking Ronald Reagan for the Star Wars plan, or ridiculing efforts since then to spend the money to build this kind of defense system, we really should not forget that now.
All right, moving on to other news of the day. Dust up with Germany and what Chancellor Angela Merkel said about the U.S., essentially that Europe needs to do its own thing, have its own momentum going forward on a number of fronts. President Trump tweeting, "We have a massive trade deficit with Germany, plus they pay far less than they should on NATO and military. Very bad for U.S. This will change." Well, there was a dust-up of this, and Sean Spicer dealt with it at the briefing today.
She said the time when Europe could rely solely on others is somewhat in the past. And as I've witnessed over the past few days, Europe must take its fate into its own hands. This means working in friendship with the U.S., the UK, and neighborly relations with Russia and other partners. That's great. That's what the president called for.
White House is saying that's a good thing.
Well, yes, it's a good thing until you think it through. I mean, do we really want to see a united Europe led by Germany? Last time that happened, it didn't really turn out that well. Now, I'm not implying this is the same generation, but there's a reason why every president since Truman has wanted to tie Europe to the United States. And now you've got the British leaving the EU, Brexit. You've got a president in the United States who really wants to see Europe go off on its own, or at least gave that impression. We may rue the day when the Germans are not tied down by transatlantic bonds. You know, the famous statement of the first Secretary General of NATO was NATO was created to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. In the end, probably the Germans will end up leading a united Europe, but we need to cultivate whatever ties we have. It's not a day to rejoice when we weaken the transatlantic ties.
Abby?
Yeah, I think Charles is one of many who are disappointed with the president's, not only his substantive response, but obviously his style of the way he likes to fight. They're both playing to the street a little bit. She's under an election campaign. Donald Trump's unpopular. His base loves this kind of talk, but it has long-term implications. And I thought it was interesting that Spicer actually was trying to undo it. He was saying, let me read this statement about how we're going to work together in friendship. And then when asked about the relationship between Merkel and Trump, he said it had gone so well during their visit here, and that it was fairly unbelievable, I think, are the words that he used. I think it was
unbelievable.
Yeah, I think it was unbelievable, which is sort of, had like a double, triple meaning in there. But he was not actually backing up the president's tweet. He was trying to walk it back a little, which I thought was an interesting
Bottom line here is that they want Europe to step up. Whether you're critical like Charles about how he did it, they are seeing the benefits or how they perceive a change in Europe's actions.
Yeah, and of course the media was very much on the story even before Donald Trump's tweet this morning. But Sean was right about her statement was not. I mean, I get that it was in Diplo speak it was probably a step back of sorts, but it was not this this searing rift between the two or anything like that. And it reminds me of when Donald Trump talked about NATO being an anachronism, being outdated. Everyone thought that, okay, this means he wants to undo NATO altogether. Well, that's not at all what he was saying. What he was saying, when your phone is outdated, you don't just throw your phone away and never get a new phone. You update it. And I believe that is what he intended, and he's had some success there.
All right, the idea of NATO being outdated might have made sense in the 90s when Russia had disappeared. Russia is back. It's now halfway in Ukraine. It took a piece of Georgia, threatening Estonia, buzzing our airplanes. That's why we had NATO in the first place, and that's why it is not obsolete and why we need it. And we will rue the day if we're the ones who cause its breaking up.
A lot of the briefing was spent on Russia, questions about the Russia investigation. Jared Kushner says he will cooperate and testify, whoever wants him to testify. There was the Michael Flynn development. He is going to put forward documents to the Senate Intelligence Committee, and we're following all elements of that. I want to turn to something that popped late this afternoon, though, and a warning here to this image. It may be upsetting. We didn't cover it earlier in the show. This is Kathy Griffin, and she has a photo shoot with a beheaded Donald Trump, and obviously to make a statement, and she is talking about that with the photographer she did it with, just popping late this afternoon. Take a listen.
Right? Yeah. We're going to go to, we have to move to Mexico today because we're going to go to prison, federal prison. Yeah. Call your dad, apologize, but let's, you, me, and Daryl just go to Mexico today because we're not surviving this.
So saying she could move to Mexico. Obviously, this is all over the internet. It's getting all kinds of coverage. Charlie.
You know, I don't know if she's trying to be funny here or provocative or what. And also, I don't know. She's holding up the thing like she's a terrorist. So I don't understand any of the message here. But it's disgusting, and it is so much worse than anything that the left is claiming Donald Trump does to degrade politics. Nothing degrades politics like stunts like that.
AB.
It's pretty depraved and dark, and she even gave a reason for the bloody head was something that was inspired by the things he said about Megyn Kelly a year and a half ago. I mean, it's so wrong and so offensive, but it's also just completely strange.
Charles.
Political pornography from a D-list comedian trying to get attention, and she has succeeded.
If you're CNN, do you say she still does New Year's Eve?
I'll leave it up to the mavens at CNN. I can assure you this, I won't be watching it.
Next up, should the U.S. Senate and should Senate Republicans get rid of the filibuster altogether?
4100. Coventry Direct, redefining insurance.
The concerns that he's had with the pace of the Senate has been longstanding. Obviously, the use of the filibuster and the rules of the Senate are ultimately up to Senator McConnell. This president was elected to get things done, and he wants to see things move through the House and the Senate, especially when you've got a majority of support and people to stop playing games.
There's not a single senator in the majority who thinks we ought to change the legislative filibuster, not one.
Just to follow up on the earlier questions, are you committing that under your leadership you will never remove the legislative filibuster?
Correct.
Well, the president disagrees. Donald Trump tweeting today, the U.S. Senate should switch to 51 votes immediately, get health care and tax cuts approved fast and easy. Dems would do it, no doubt. Just to give you a perspective on timing here on the calendar, days until September 30th, that's the next government funding deadline, 123. How many days is the Senate in session? 52. How many days is the House in session? 43. How many days are they both in session together? 43. 43 days total to get all this done. We're back with the panel. AB, the key thing here is that right now health care and tax reform fall under reconciliation, at least in current form, and it would be 51 votes in the Senate. However, if the Senate rewrites health care, includes tort reform and crossing state lines, they would need 60 votes. If tax reform is to be permanent and maybe not deficit neutral, they would need 60 votes as opposed to 51 in reconciliation. Will the filibuster be changed?
I don't think so, and that's not what, this is not a disagreement between the president and the Senate Majority Leader about the filibuster. This is him not understanding what reconciliation is. It is a procedure, a very narrow procedure to allow a partisan vote to protect them from the Democrats filibustering it. This is a Republican Party family fight. The Democrats are not stopping health care reform. They are not stopping tax reform.
But they're not helping either one either.
You know what? They're not standing in the way. Republicans are standing in the way. You can talk to all the members that are looking at trying to get the debt ceiling increased by the end of July and a vote to break all the sequester caps from 2011 and what's called the Budget Control Act. They have to do a deal with Democrats on that.
I understand, but let me just push back 1 second. If on health care you lose people because they don't buy this two-phase system where you're going to pass this under reconciliation and then suddenly going to have another bill where you're going to have tort reform and crossing state lines, and you put it together and you save a couple of votes that way, isn't that then possible?
Then he's having a fight with the Senate Majority Leader over burning up the filibuster and using it for and using the nuclear option on legislation, which is a fight I don't think he wants. I think the best route is for him to get involved and for them to try to pass these things through reconciliation, which is what the plan was all along.
You got to love Mitch McConnell, his answer. Is this ever going to be done, ever? And he says, no. And he's a straight answer. He's a man of the Senate.
Traditionalist.
And he reveres the institution. It took a lot for him to abolish the filibuster for Supreme Court. But after all, the Democrats had abolished it for everything else, so it was the logical thing to do. But I think he's right. And I agree with AB. This is right now. The reason why we don't have health care reform yet, the reason why we don't have tax reform yet, is the fact that Republicans cannot get together and agree. They finally were able to get together in the House by squeezing and pushing and suspending belief. But now in the Senate, I don't see how you're going to get even 51, given that the moderates and the more conservative elements cannot agree. So it really isn't the fault of the Democrats. The other thing is, one day the Democrats are going to be in control. And McConnell knows that. And do we really, look at what happened in 1965, 66, when the Democrats had the supermajorities and they changed America. You could argue we spent the last 50 years trying to undo the work of that one Congress and not succeeded. So right. I think the filibuster is something conservatives are going to want to keep.
So just talking, Charlie, to big donors out there who are frustrated about things not getting done, they say if you have a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican White House and you can't get it done, then when are you going to get it done? And the money's going to dry up for Republicans if they don't start moving something. And is this White House just trying to change the dynamic to get the wheels turning?
I think it's not just donors. It's regular voters. It's the old Tea Party voters and a lot of the voters who are Trump supporters. The difference is that Trump is sort of winning the argument with a lot of them, and they're just doubling down their blame on Republicans, which I don't think is entirely unfair. But Trump's this effort by Trump is he's not a conservative ideologue. He is a populist, and the idea that he's recommending to the Senate that they need to get rid of the filibuster is a very populist sort of message to play. The great thing is that you have Republicans like Mitch McConnell who are like, yeah, no, we don't agree on that. We're going to go our own way.
And we will see. We'll cover it all when we come back. A Memorial Day moment for a soldier from a complete stranger.
Are you a veteran, own a home, and need cash?
IRA Investor Kit, so you can help protect and grow your portfolio in 2017. Call 1-800-889-8000. 1-800-889-8000. Call now.
Tonight, Memorial Day, is a time for the country to remember those who died serving this country, but it's also unfortunately known for travel headaches during that weekend. They're frequent. U.S. Army mechanic Keaton Tilson was stuck in a Dallas airport trying to fly standby to get home. Things were not looking good until passenger Josh Rainey came to the rescue.
I called my wife, which I would do in a situation like that, to kind of ask for her advice, and we agreed both that it was the right thing to do to go back and buy the ticket.
For him to do that, not even knowing who I am, was just made me so appreciative. There's really nothing I could do at that point to kind of repay the favor, and I don't think he was really looking for anything like that, but I just felt really appreciative, so I gave him a hug. I even kind of shedded a tear a little bit.
Congratulations. Fair bounce and unafraid.